My next guest this evening is MP Andrew Bridgen, who has spent the last 10 years and more fighting for justice for the sub-postmasters in his constituency, those who were wrongly convicted of theft theft from the post office. Andrew joins me now. Good evening, Andrew. Good to see you again. When did you become aware of this exactly, and in what way?
Well, it's actually 14 years ago when I was elected. Within weeks of being elected as a newly Conservative MP, I had a surgery appointment booked with Mr and Mrs Rudkin, and they told me what at the time appeared to be an unbelievable story of how they were falsely convicted of fraud. They were actually fitted up by the post office and Fujitsu. My constituent, Michael Rudkin, had been a successful sub-postmaster for years with no problems, a pillar of the local community in Ibstock. He'd been actually selected as the representative for all the sub-postmasters in the UK. He'd gone on a visit to Fujitsu's headquarters in that position. He believed they'd mistaken him for someone else, and they actually took him down into the basement and showed their engineers altering Horizon. This is in 2008. And when they discovered who he was, they threw him out the building. He came back to Ibstock, and very, very shortly afterwards, they were raided, and they were accused of taking £44,000 shortfall on the computer, and his wife was convicted of fraud.
And it's the fact that people have died since. People committed suicide because of their desperation and whatever else. People are still in jail. The convictions have not all been quashed. What on earth is going on that, despite it all being out in the open, people are still languishing under the guilt of conviction?
Well, there's at least 736 sub-postmasters convicted on Horizon evidence alone. The Post Office had always maintained it was impossible to alter the computer records in a sub-postmaster's office without them knowing about it. That was untrue, as Mr Rudkin had uncovered, and so it was always going to be their fault, and there was no glitches in the system, which that was untrue as well. So we knew all those convictions were unsafe by 2014. Oliver Letwin was in the group of 5 MPs. He was in the Cabinet Office, and he was David Cameron's political advisor. I'd have no doubt he was briefing the Prime Minister at the time on something as important as what we'd uncovered.
At what point did those in positions to do something about it know that the sub-postmasters were innocent? How long has that been?
Well, I managed to... We ambushed the post office. They were maintaining their system was bomb-proof, so I managed to get a really diligent forensic accountant who I'd become acquainted with, called Ron Warmington of Second Sight. He got in there, and very shortly afterwards, it was clear that the system was very, very leaky, and that all those convictions were unsafe. So certainly by 2014, I knew, I believe the government knew, and the Post Office knew, and the sub-postmasters knew.
I was oblivious to the horror of this. However, that said, I mean, on here, on this show, a couple of years ago now, more than a couple of years ago, we had on Nick Wallace, an author who had spent time investigating. I think there's a clip.
In 2010, the Post Office was made aware of the Justice for Sub-Postmasters Alliance and the fact that they had the backing of several MPs. However, they did nothing about it. They denied that anything was wrong until in 2012, a group of independent forensic accountants called Second Sight were brought in by the Post Office to look at their Horizon computer system. And Second Sight found that there were faults, there were errors.
Now, I mean, needless to say, you know, nothing happened in the aftermath.
Well, I told the government, you can't let the Post Office pay for their own investigation. It's got to be paid by the Cabinet Office, or else the moment that Ron finds anything and Second Sight find anything, they'll get shut down. And that's exactly what happened. In the end, Ron Warmington, because he's a man of high morals, leaked the unredacted information to me because the Post Office were redacting all his reports to cover it all up, even at that point in 2012.
Andrew, as a lawyer,
yes,
listening to this with your legal hat on, what's your
it's completely
scandalous.
scandalous. I mean, and there's a number of things here. You hear of the tragic cases where people have said, look, if you plead guilty to fraudulent accounting, you may not go to prison. And basically, people who were innocent were forced to plead guilty. And we always say, baby lawyers, the first thing you're told is better that 99 guilty people get off than one innocent person gets convicted. And it's completely scandalous. The whole thing about the fact it took an ITV drama to bring this to light is extraordinary. What I also say, there's a number of other questions that need to be raised in terms of they denied the fact afterwards that he ever visited Fujitsu.
I rang up, spoke to Fujitsu, wrote to them and said, I'm writing on behalf of my constituent, Mr Rudkin. He says he visited your head office at Bracknell on this date, and they first of all claimed that he'd never been on the premises. And then I said, well, he says he claims that he signed the visitors book. And, of course, they said they'd lost the visitors book for that day. And the emails all came out, a whistleblower from Fujitsu eventually, and everything that... the unbelievable story of fraud and false criminalisation that my constituents had told me those years before, everything was true.
It is extraordinary. And the other thing as well, which hasn't come out yet, is about Adam Crozier. Because Adam Crozier at that time was head of Royal Mail. He, I think from 2003 to 2010, he then went from the head of Royal Mail to ITV. And he doesn't feature at all in the drama. And I don't know why that is.
Why does it take a drama? That sounds almost farcical, that after all of the testimony, all of the truth-telling, all the way down the line, why, when a drama goes out on television, does it suddenly tip
Well,
the
it was a
balance?
well-made drama, and it pulled on the heartstrings, as the story does. I mean, it's deeply distressing when you meet the victims themselves. But the fact is, I find abhorrent, is that I had been to ITV, BBC, Sky, Channel News and all the major newspapers. I had all the evidence that the convictions were unsafe in 2014, and I went for years and nobody would run the story. I said to the journalists, you'll get an award if you run this story. These people are all innocent and here's the proof. No media outlet would run that story.
What will it cost to put it right? There's vast amounts of money in terms of legal fees and all of the rest of it. You know, what's the bill and who foots it?
It's going to be the taxpayer, whatever happens. Ultimately, the post office is owned by the government, so we'll foot the bill. But they've got to have proper compensation. I managed to get Mrs Rudkin in the first 9 that had her criminal prosecution overturned. Right. And that was in December 2020. Mr and Mrs Rudkin still haven't got their compensation.
What about Fujitsu? I mean, Fujitsu's a private company, and doesn't it carry the
Well,
can
I think
in
the
part?
fact that they, as far as I'm concerned, it's no coincidence that after Mr Rudkin uncovered what was going on in 2008, that his wife had suddenly got a...
Welcome back. My next guest is Michael Rudkin. Michael ran a post office in Ibstock with his wife Susan. He was also chair of the National Sub-Postmasters Federation. Their lives changed forever when they were accused of taking £44,000. Michael joins me now. Michael, it's an appalling catalogue of events which we've all been piecing together over the last, weeks or years, depending. But what has this done to you and Susan? Where are you now, physically and emotionally? And
I can tell you that emotionally, we're both physically drained and wrecked as a result of what's transpired. What's little known is we came into this industry in 1995, Susan and I, and we were privileged to be selected by the post office to actually run a branch, so much so that we were then granted a second branch, of which we ran that as well in conjunction with the other branch. It then came to the point where my sons didn't want to follow on in the business because they were so disillusioned with what was transpiring and they could see what was happening to mum and dad, that they chose a different career path.
But I can only imagine that, traditionally you would have been regarded as, pillars of the community. The local post office is a significant place for a lot of people. And what happened to you going from that, a pillar, to suddenly being accused and put in the spotlight of being a thief?
Well, that was a very difficult moment in my life in particular, because I've got a double-edged sword. One is I appear to have fallen from grace, and B, I'm in a position where I've got to defend the position of my wife, because I knew for a fact that Susan wouldn't ever take a penny piece from anybody, and yet there she is, accused. They couldn't get at me but as a union rep, but then they decided they were going to focus their attentions on Susan, and they prosecuted her.
And how do you feel about the fact that you've yet to receive any compensation? I mean, or are you getting any kind of apology from anyone about what you went through?
Well, I in particular have had an interim payment, which is very small. The fact that we've got Susan, who is part of the group that were prosecuted, of which we've got just under 1,000 that are waiting for their convictions to be overturned, where we've got also 90 some that have had the convictions overturned, and that's taken up to now 20 years. Are you really asking me to believe that it's going to take another decade before the rest of the sub-postmasters are cleared?
Gents, how can this be? How can, when we know that there was, that the people are innocent, why are there still outstanding?
Absolutely scandalous. And that, what Sunak was saying this week is they want to basically push forward everything. They're going to forgive everybody, as I understand it.
Forgive?
Even if, that's what I know. Well, even those who may be guilty, they just pardon and say, look, completely exonerated, because it is scandalous. We were chatting in the green room beforehand. Because it's what happens. You were vilified in the community as well, and I think you're saying that lots of people who were assumed that you were guilty, they've come and apologised. They're ringing you on your doorbell now, leaving presents and saying just how sorry they are on that sort of thing. But one question I've got, in terms of the ITV drama, you talked about Sean Dooley, I think, played you. To what extent were you part of that narrative and actually helping them with writing the script and so on and so forth?
Well, it's difficult to explain because there were so many different avenues. But I had a Zoom call with Sean.
Yes.
Because he wanted to get it to grips with my character. He put questions to me to see what kind of reaction he would get so that he would have empathy with that and then to be able to portray it within the dramatisation, of which I have to say, yet again, the guy had done an excellent job, as did the rest of the actors that participated in this programme. I want to cover one other point with you, Andrew.
Yes.
That you mentioned about the statement from Sunak in Parliament giving everybody the so-called pardon.
Yes.
What is dangerous about this, what we need to see is the detail. The devil is in the detail. And for somebody to stand there and say that we will do this, but we want a statement of innocence, for everybody to sign it, and if at some point in the future we think you may have done something wrong, we will be able to come back and have redress against that. Well, we've already experienced what happens when the judge and jury becomes the executioner. I wouldn't want to see any of my members, former members, put in that position
So it's
again.
understandable you wouldn't have faith in the system. What would you like to see happen?
What I would like to see happen is for people to get their act together and start issuing proper compensation levels. I hate this term when they say, we want to restore you back to where you were when this started. I'm 66 next, in a couple of months. I don't want to be back where I was. I want to know how I'm going to fund the next 20 years of my retirement. And it's not with an interim payment of £75,000.
We can't have pardons, because you get pardons when you've done something wrong and you're
Exactly.
forgiven.
It's the wrong language.
They've got to be exonerated, because these people did not commit any crimes.
And also, Andrew, though, you know, the technology was trumpeted and put in place by Tony Blair. The whole scandal unfolded under David Cameron's government. You know, Ed Davey, as it turns out, was the postal minister who was simultaneously taking money from the legal firm chasing the postmistresses falsely and the postmasters. Who's going to carry the can for this? When will we get somebody who actually stands up and says, this was me? Keir Starmer, you know, was in some way either turning a blind eye or in some way didn't see what was happening.
Well, after I got, Michael, a Zoom meeting with Boris Johnson, the then Prime Minister, that's when we got the public inquiry. I haven't given my evidence to the public inquiry. When the evidence is complete, I think we've got to hold all these characters to account, and certainly Fujitsu, certainly ministers. It's what they knew, when they knew it, and why they didn't act. Because this can't be allowed to happen again. And I think history's repeated itself too many times. Yeah. You know, 11 years over thalidomide, 30 years over the Gulf War syndrome, the infected blood's still not been paid out, those victims. This is deliberate. Yeah,
you're absolutely right. We always say history repeats itself because we don't learn the lessons from history, and this absolute scandal needs to be addressed. But looking at that sort of side, you went to Fujitsu, they tried to hide that.
Well, the fact that they turn around and say I didn't exist, I never appeared that day.
Right.
I mean, that's really pushing the pale. I've signed the invitation book. Security level in that building is absolutely unparalleled on anything I've ever experienced. But then also the shock of being taken down into the boiler room to watch these experiments happening at altering remotely branches' accounts. And when challenged and specifically asked twice, are you doing this real time?
Yes.
Reply, yes. I need to ask you again, are you doing this real time? Response, yes. I've told my members that no remote access can be done through a remote location. The accounts belong to the Postmaster and only he can sign them off when completed, and you have entered them remotely. And then to be ushered out of the building as though I'm some common criminal.
Yeah. Outrageous, and that came screamingly through in the drama. The other question, of course, is where is the money? Because if you're turning around and saying there was a deficit, the sub-posts that you know well we should answer in their profits.
I know where it is. Very early on in the investigation, anyone who's dealt with accounts, double entry bookkeeping, every account system has a suspense account. That's where you put items until you know where to put it properly.
Right.
The suspense account on Horizon was mysterious. In this bomb-proof system was normally in credit at the end of the year between £1 million and £1.5 million. And after 4 years, the post office directors were just pushing that £1.5 million a year into profits. Well, in a bomb-proof system, you don't have £1.5 million of uncompleted transactions in surplus. I think if you add all that money up for 15, 20 years, that's the money that was extorted.
So people need to look at that. So the sub-post office master, who basically had to make up the apparent deficit when there was no deficit, out of their own money,
it's a bit more complicated. Fujitsu had told the post office it was a bomb-proof system.
Yeah.
The post office put them on a penalty clause, £20 penalty clause for every non-completed transaction. They'd got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds every day. They paid engineers to fix them instead of paying over the penalty clause. And human nature being what it is as well, someone's going to press the wrong key, and instead of having a 20, 30, 40 pound problem, you've got a bigger problem, and they were never going to admit to it.
Do you know what's interesting as well? In the wider context, we're all being pushed towards technology, artificial intelligence, and all of the rest of it.
Make mistakes,
our lives are going to be better because these things are infallible. And you look at this, you look at the lives destroyed, and you look at the willingness with which politicians from highest to lowest were ready to say that machine is infallible, and therefore it must be the humans who got it.
And also, Fujitsu have got lots of contracts across government and
several billion.
And I think, you know, there was certainly the child maintenance service, which has been heavily criticised by the National Audit Office. They certainly had a Fujitsu system in until at least 2021, and you know, there's lots of people who have committed suicide because of being chased for arrears there.
Michael, a last question to you: is there anything that can compensate you realistically? You know, this is more than 10 years. This is 10 years of your life that you don't get back. You know, I mean, realistically, what could put you ahead of the game?
Susan and I might not get that 10 years back, but I tell you what we don't want. We don't want this apathy and pathetic, I'm sorry, I apologise. I want my life and that of my wife's financially back on track so we can see the rest of our years out. Now, it was raised earlier about the competency of the Fujitsu system. I was also privy at the time, whilst in office, that there was something called the Highland account. Now, people were going in and they were paying their electric bills and this, that and the other, and they were getting the receipts. And then all of a sudden, because they were on budget programmes, the service provider got on and they said, you haven't made your weekly payment. Where's the money? We're going to have to take you off the scheme. Those people ran back straight away to the post office and produced the receipts and said, where's the money gone? We then find out, post office hushed it up very quickly, and believe me, very quickly, because this is the first time this issue has been raised. And the reason that they hushed it up, because that money for the Highland account, for the gas and electric and telephone, the money that was being paid in weekly actually was directed into that account until the public started to raise a fuss. Then it was stopped, it was closed down, and the money was reimbursed.
A whole other story there, Michael. Thank you so much for coming in. Thank you for speaking so frankly and honestly about what this has been like for you. Thank you also, Andrew Bridgen, once again, for turning the spotlight on something that matters. I'm on another break, I'm afraid, after which I'll be joined by